In the last video, we looked at Mead's ideas about symbolic language, meaning making, and the self. I think you can see by now that symbolic interaction places a great deal of emphasis on the ways in which society influences the self and social interaction. Mead summarized this relationship as follows: society shapes self, shapes social behavior. In this video, we're going to look at identity theories, which elaborate on those ideas and explain how people come to understand themselves as a part of society or as a part of social interactions. These theories depart from classical symbolic interaction in an important way. They incorporate social structure into their explanations of how people understand themselves. In classical symbolic interaction, society exists only in the interaction. Meaning is created and then recreated from moment to moment, and the viewpoint of the theorist never moves past the interaction to examine larger features of society. But individuals do not interact in vacuums. They exist in communities and in organizations. So identity theory looks at larger features of society, treating individuals as if they were situated in relatively stable social networks that result in repeating patterns of relationship and interaction. This viewpoint comes to us from structural symbolic interaction, a theoretical research program within symbolic interaction. A theoretical research program is a set of theories that share theoretical concepts and sometimes the same assumptions. Within a theoretical research program, individual theories are known as unit theories. We're going to look at two unit theories today: structural identity theory and the perceptual control model of identity. One of the major questions asked by structural symbolic interaction is, how do social structures influence the self? Consequently, one of the overarching goals of identity theories is to explain how meanings that make up the various identities a person has will influence the self and social interaction. So we're going to look at both structural identity theory and the perceptual control model to see how they deal with that question. But before we do, let's look at some of the concepts both unit theories use. An identity is a set of meanings. These meanings are attached to the roles individuals occupy in a social structure, groups they identify with, or the unique ways in which they see themselves. These meanings facilitate interaction between individuals by allowing an individual to know where they are in a social order. Notice how this concept of identity is very structural. Identities are formed as a consequence of someone's location in a social system. There are three distinct forms of identity: role identity, group identity, and personal identity. And each of these forms deals with a different pattern of social relationships. Role identities have to do with the roles people are required to perform as a consequence of their locations in a social system. Roles include things like teacher, student, CEO, mother, or father. Most people hold many of these identities. We all have many roles to fill as we go about our lives. Right now, I'm playing the role of instructor and you the role of student. The meanings we attach to these roles influence how we play them out. Group identities are related to one's membership in a group. Group identities are sets of meanings that emerge when interacting in a group, a specific set of people, like a working team at a corporation or a group of friends. This is not the same thing as a social identity, which has to do with the categorizations of groups of people in society. Identity theory really doesn't explicitly deal with the concept of social identity. Finally, we have personal identity. These are sets of meanings that distinguish a person from others. These identities are not derived from role or group identities. They can include things like whether or not a person sees themselves as moral or honest or open, things like that. When a person forms a personal identity, they internalize their culture's understanding of that identity. So an individual who has a moral identity would think of themselves as moral in the sense that their culture understands morality. Meanings are how an individual understands a specific identity. Meanings are the responses and reflections that an individual has of themselves in a role or a group or as a person. Meanings relating to an identity will be influenced by social structure and culture, but are formed personally, so they can vary from one individual to the next, even for the same identity. What does it mean to be a good student? For some students, it means studying hard and trying your best. For others, it means getting an A no matter what. Same identity, two different meanings. Both of them from a common cultural understanding of being a good student. Identity salience is the probability that one will evoke a specific identity across situations. Individuals choose to enact identities that are highly salient more than they choose to enact identities that are less salient. Because we have multiple identities, and each identity can have a different salience, we can think about identities in a salience hierarchy, with more salient identities at the top of the hierarchy being more likely to be invoked in any situation. Prominence is the extent to which one thinks an identity is important. Identities that are very prominent for a person are very important to that person. Often there will be a lot of overlap between prominent and salient identity. Do you know someone that constantly brings up an identity even when they don't seem that important to the situation? You can bet that identity is highly prominent to that person. But prominent identities are not necessarily salient. An old friend of mine used to be an explosive ordnance disposal technician. This person had a very specific role in the military, and their role identity became very important to them. They retired from the military some time ago, and obviously they're no longer enacting the role of EOD tech. So the identity is prominent to them, but it's not salient. It's important to them, but they don't enact it in most situations. Just as an identity can be prominent but not salient, it can also be salient but not prominent. Someone can be called, for example, to enact a role identity in many situations of their life, but not think of that role as a very important part of understanding who they are. Often, people who work in IT find themselves in this situation. If you work in IT, there's a very good chance that you will be called to enact your IT role in many situations. At work, but also when interacting with friends and family who want free computer help. The hapless IT worker finds their IT role highly salient, but they don't necessarily need to think of that role as important for understanding who they are. The role can be salient, but not prominent. Social structure represents specialized networks of social relationship. You interact with your friends and family relatively frequently. You probably also have acquaintances with whom you interact. You probably don't interact with your state senator at all. Social structure is a stable pattern of these interaction relationships. The initial formulation of identity theory, which I've been calling structural identity theory, was developed in large part by Sheldon Stryker. The theory is fairly straightforward. It assumes that social structure affects the commitment an individual has to their identity. That commitment impacts the salience of role identities, and the salience of an identity impacts the social behaviors of the person. Specifically, the extent to which an identity will be enacted within a situation. The more an individual is committed to an identity, the greater the salience of that identity to that person. This assumption means that if an individual has a strong commitment to an identity, they should choose to enact it in more situations. In structural identity theory, commitment is the extent to which a person's social relationship depends on possessing a particular identity. If a person abandons an identity, how will that affect their social relationships? If abandoning an identity means abandoning a meaningful social relationship, so there is a built-in assumption in this concept. Social structure influences commitment. Let me explicitly illustrate all of the assumptions of this theory. Assumption 1. The social structure in which an individual is situated will influence their commitment to the various identities they hold. Assumption 2. The greater a person's commitment to an identity, the more salient that identity will be. Assumption 3. The more salient an identity is, the more likely a person will choose to engage in the social behaviors that enact that identity. This causal model illustrates the theoretical relationship. Increases in commitment to an identity increase the identity salience, which in turn increases the chances that a person will enact that identity in a given situation. Notice how at each step along the way we have something to predict. Patterns of social relationships predict commitment, which predicts the salience hierarchy of a person's identities, which in turn predict their behavior in a situation. This is all very testable, and that's a good thing. You can also see that this theoretical formulation is very simple. 4 concepts linked together by 3 assumptions. So what can we explain with this theory? Well, here's one example. I'm using the word religiosity here to mean the extent to which one participates in religious activities. So things like attending a service, prayer, meditation, or other religious behaviors. These are all social behaviors. So working our way back in the causal chain, identity theory predicts that religiosity will increase with the salience of a person's religious identity. And so people with highly salient religious identities, which is a type of group identity, will spend more time engaging in religious activity. Religious identities are made salient by a person's commitment to their religious identity. Commitment is increased by the extent to which a person maintains their important social relationships by maintaining their religious identity. So, if a person's social networks include a lot of important relationships to religious others, we can expect their commitment to religious identity to be high, as long as their relationships depend on that religious identity. In turn, we can expect them to understand themselves as a religious person and to engage in religious activity. And when we look at the data, that's exactly what we find. So how do individuals come to understand themselves as highly religious and consequently choose to engage in religious behavior? Well, it happens because their religious identity is highly salient. Why is it salient? Because they're integrated into social networks that require a religious identity, increasing their commitment. Is it any wonder then that people who experience a loss of religious belief often report painful experiences of losing important social relationships? We can also use these relationships to explain changes in commitment. Has a person's commitment to an identity decreased? Well, if it has, we should be able to explain that change by a change in the patterns of their social relationships. The other version of identity theory I want to introduce to you is known as the perceptual control process model of identity theory, or the identity control process model. Where structural identity theory is really concerned with explaining how social structure influences personal understandings of identity, the perceptual control process model is more focused on how individuals understand and organize their identities within social interactions. Identity theory assumes that an individual's self-understanding reflects the various identities that they hold, not only in terms of absolute numbers, but also in terms of the salience and prominence of various identities. Where structural identity theory explains how structural features of society impact an individual's self-understanding, the perceptual control process model explains how self-understandings are regulated. This version of identity theory is a cybernetic model of identity. Cybernetic models are models of regulatory systems. Usually they give you a means to model systems that try to control something or maintain a steady state. A common example is that of an air conditioning system. You have in an air conditioning system a thermostat that detects the temperature and an air conditioning unit. You're comparing the temperature to a desired temperature, and when there's great enough difference, the air conditioner turns on to control or regulate the air. So the perceptual control process model is a version of identity theory that explains how individuals regulate their identities. Identity verification means that an individual's perception of how others see them in a situation is the same as how they see themselves. In other words, I have an identity that is being enacted in a situation. If I think that you think of my identity in the same way that I think of my identity, then my identity is verified. So if a college student thinks of themselves as a good student, and they come to believe that others see them as a good student, then their identity is verified. For the perceptual control process model of identity, commitment is the extent to which an individual will try to verify an identity. That is, the amount of work they do to ensure that others see themselves the same way they do. The perceptual control model is conceptualized as a feedback loop which works to maintain an individual's sense of self. The model has 5 parts: the identity standard, the perceptual input, the comparator, emotion, and output. The identity standard is the set of meanings individuals hold for an identity in question. A perceptual input is the set of meanings about the self that an individual gets from the interaction they're involved in. Perceptual inputs include reflected appraisals, which are an individual's understanding of how others see their identity. The comparator is a process that compares the perceptual input with the identity standard. This process produces emotion. Emotions exist in the system as an indication of the extent to which perceptual inputs and identity standards are in agreement with one another. They're like the thermostat in the system. Outputs are behaviors that individuals engage in as a result of this process. Outputs carry with them meanings related to the identities that are active in the situation. So there are perceptual inputs which carry meaning and outputs which carry meaning. Notice that meanings of identity move throughout this entire model. Let's look at an example of this model in action. Here we have an individual. Let's call him Tom. He's in a social interaction. A salient identity is active in the situation. Tom thinks of himself as a hard worker, so his identity standard for the role identity worker includes meanings like diligent, hard worker, and initiative. Tom is an employee at a local grocery store, and he's working his shift. A customer he's interacting with is behaving in a way that Tom perceives to indicate something about his worker identity. Suppose he is assisting the customer who remarks, "Thanks, you've been so helpful." This remark is perceived by Tom to mean that the customer sees him as diligent and hardworking. Tom's reflected appraisal of the customer's remarks is then compared to his identity standard, and because they're similar, positive emotion is produced. Tom's behavioral output is to continue behaving as he was, because his view of himself has been maintained. He has achieved identity verification. But what if the customer had said something different? What if the customer had said something like, "Could you at least try to help me?" Or what if Tom interpreted the customer's remark as sarcasm? "Wow, thanks, you've been so helpful." After all, reflected appraisals are what Tom thinks the customer meant, not what the customer intended to mean. Well, in those cases, the comparator would find a mismatch between the reflected appraisal and the identity standard. That mismatch would produce negative emotion. That emotional response functions as an error signal. It tells Tom that something is not right about the situation. He thinks of himself as a hard worker, but clearly this customer does not. What has happened is known as identity non-verification. Identity non-verification causes negative emotion. In the case of non-verification, the behavioral outputs that Tom produces will be attempts to achieve verification. Remember, the point of this process is for Tom to maintain his sense of self. So he's going to respond to the error signal by behaving in ways that demonstrate he is a good worker as he understands good worker. Perhaps he might respond by being more courteous or by offering to help the customer with groceries. In this way, the perceptual control process model gives us an explanation as to why people feel bad when they believe others do not think that they measure up to an identity they hold. The model has been used to predict quite a lot of behaviors, but this video has gone on long enough. So there are the basics to both unit theories. Structural identity theory connects the larger social world to an individual's sense of self, and the perceptual control process model gives us a way of thinking about how individuals try maintaining and understanding their social selves. That's all for now. I'll see you in the next video.